Greetings and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is a podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I am your host. I am the lead pastor of the Loft-based community in Westwood, California. I'm also the associate professor of theology, ecology, and race at Methodist Theological School in Ohio. In today's episode, we'll be discussing white Christian nationalism, specifically through the lens of what an emerging movement, or I should say a movement that perhaps is becoming now more known in the mainstream culture, the New Apostolic Reformation movement. The ways in which that is continuing has influenced our politics over the last probably 25 years, and the way it's continuing to influence our politics, including the election today. So definitely a timely topic given what's happening in our political sphere. I am joined by my friends and colleagues, Wesley Garcia and Reverend Blair Trickstasto. How are y'all doing?
I'm doing okay. Considering everything, I'm okay.
I was just say I don't love thinking about these things. So
Yeah.
my body is a little off, there's like a little fight or flight happening in these conversations, but I know this is an important topic to talk about, and I know that you're safe people to talk to about it. So
Couldn't agree more. Reading these articles, reading up on the Apostolic Reformation, I was just at like a pit in my stomach, just like tense. Is frustrating, but happy to be here with y'all.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. Like, reading this is triggering. I mean, you're just like, oh my gosh, people think this is wild, and there's so many people who think about it. Blair,
And
what
that
were
it's
you
a
gonna
growing
say?
movement.
Yes.
Like it's not just some like niche in the corner somewhere. We'll get into it, but it's concerning.
And I thought actually I was going to study. I got into theology through studying religion and politics. And I thought I was going to study religion and politics and then accidentally went to seminary, which is a whole other conversation. But it's like circling back to like really deep stories of how America came to be America. Like these aren't like we're reading about this quote unquote new movement, but it's not new. Like it's very, very old actually. And And I ended up going into theology and ministry because I wanted to counteract from a spiritual perspective the lies that are being told by movements like New Apostolic Reformation. So yeah, it like hits really deep for me that this is a really important and also really difficult conversation to help people enter into.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm glad, as both of you said, that we could have this conversation to really educate our audience about what's going on behind the scenes and things that they may not know. And so for those of you who don't know, the New Apostolic Reformation is not necessarily new. It was founded in the 90s, but it's definitely a powerful Christian supremacy movement that has attempted and is continuing to attempt to transform culture and politics in the United States and countries across the world into a Christian authoritarianism, is basically the way to describe it. Like, it is a way for them to enforce Christian beliefs, practices, and norms on society. Uh, it adheres to this way, actually, before I even get into what it adheres to, I think I should say that they actually believe they have been called by God to rule, right? They literally use the language of like ruling over others, like
These
that.
are the Storm the Capitol Christians. Like
Yes.
Literally, these are the Storm the Capitol
Yeah,
Christians.
that's who we're talking about. Absolutely.
that's
Full circle.
That's a fair way to put it, actually. Like it is literally the opposite kinds of Christians that we are discussing. It is not it is, they are the ones who were instrumental in actually organizing people to be at the Capitol when the storming, when things were going to take place. These are the folks who played a huge role. Dutch Sheets, Lance Wallnall, they started a campaign to undo Trump's defeat. Lance Sheets, charismatic leader in the movement, created a devotional app that he ran to rally up his members and promote the lie of Trump's reelection, and launched what he called a prayer and prophecy tour after President Biden's election. And that led people to be mobilized to the Capitol on January 6th. And so that is, people came there thinking that this prophecy that Trump was going to
Mm-hmm.
actually be reinstalled was going to take place. And so, as much as we want to think about this through the lens of just race, often because you see these white people there, it is so profoundly religious. Like Christian supremacy is the moral force that is guiding this way of thinking, and it is quite honestly, it's frightening. It's frightening.
Yeah.
Because ultimately religion is about thinking about the like biggest things, right? The study of religion is thinking about the biggest things, what motivates people, towards what, from what, to what, and then how that happens. And so religion, differently but similarly to culture, can become all encompassing to a person's world and actions. And so when religion is used in such a manipulative way, it is dangerous. I mean, like, people, like, martyrdom is a thing within religion for a reason. And these people genuinely believe that they are martyrs on behalf of a movement that they genuinely and truly believe is the right thing. And so convincing them away from that it's almost, and I'm not a scholar of cults, but I know that they're like high control religions leaning towards cults, and cults are those like generally it's about the like boundariedness of whether like how much someone is rejected if they leave, or like how deeply it disrupts your social system if you try to exit a belief system. That's usually what like separates a cult from a high control religion. But high control religions are like leaning towards cults, and I would say there are definitely congregations or groups within this NAR movement that are cults,
Yeah.
that are
Totally.
where if you try to
Totally.
leave, your whole world will fall apart. Yeah, it's just scary for the people who are in it, and for the people who are trying to get out of it, and for those of us watching from the outside.
100%. What I was going to add to that is that I think even though we wouldn't necessarily call like conservative Christian traditions cults, or but they are high control. Like so many of the people who have come to the loft, who have met since leaving Iowa, like they talk about their entire social circle collapsing when they became affirming, or when they, decided to be more inclusive. So like there's parallels with even conservative Christianity, or versions of conservative Christianity, and this infinitely more cultish experience of this NAR, New Apostolic Reformation.
And I think that the reason those tentacles exist is because of their idea that they are called to control. I mean, they believe that that's a deep part of the story they tell themselves. And so I'm pulling from an article by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which really talks about the ways in which they they have designated them like as a hate group, that they're watching people who practice this particular understanding of Christianity. And so they have a quote in here I want to read. Dutch Sheets, who's a prophet within this tradition, Lance Wallnau, another prophet, Murillo, and Hank Kuhneman writes, are four of the most influential Christian leaders in the U.S. Yet most people probably have never heard of them. As leaders of a Christian supremacist movement that decreed publicly in 2022 that they believe they have a God-given right to rule the United States, and that they have been given legal power and authority from heaven, these far-right figures claim to be God's ambassadors and spokespeople over the earth, who are equipped and delegated by Him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy. And I think this is what's known as the Watchman Decree, this idea that they are supposedly called by God to literally have an authoritarian view of the world. It's a extension of a broken theological view of, around dominion that people pull from the Hebrew Bible, that they pull from the creation narratives. This idea that as being created in God's image has led us to have supposed to have a particular kind of power and authority over others. And it's the language and ideology of dominion that we see pervasive in the ways in which we talk about so many things today, whether we're talking about the genocide of indigenous people and the notion of American progress, like all
Yeah.
these come from the language and logics of dominion.
Manifest destiny, right? So when I was saying like this is very old, manifest destiny is grounded in this. But even back to Hebrew scripture, so there something we have to deal with in the Hebrew Bible is that when the Israelites had a king, and even before that, when they were entering into the land of Israel were like given the command by God to slaughter everyone that they met in Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the
Mm-hmm.
ban we talk about in the book, in the story of Joshua. And so like this idea that if you are commissioned by God to be in control, that you may do that by any means necessary. And that belief has been utilized over and over and over and over again, and very frequently by white people, European people, and then American white people, to justify their control and their violence. And it's
Yeah.
I
such a
think
like in the scripture,
Mhm.
it's such a small
Mhm.
piece, and then it
Mhm.
gets criticized like crazy in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So it's not. It's like they take this one story, this one example, and decide that that must be true for them too, when that is such a small piece of the history of the people of God, and it's one that we've atoned for or tried to confess of and atone for. But instead, they just keep repeating it.
it's so fascinating you bring this up. So when I was back in Ohio, I was on a panel on a friend of mine, Dr. Kate Common's book called Undoing Conquest, which actually challenges the notion of the Joshua narrative, but basically saying that archaeological evidence suggests that this obviously did not happen, that in actuality, Joshua was written hundreds of years later through the lens of Babylonian Empire framework to
Right.
kind of say, to project basically this is what we should have done, but not what we actually did. It's so good. I'm going to have Dr.
Mhm.
Common. She's going to be out here visiting in the a little bit under a year from now. But her book is doing the heavy lifting of helping us rethink the conquest narratives that are in the biblical text, and how might we create a new origin story is the word that what she frames
Yeah.
it. But I want to return or say a little bit about the language of dominion,
Mm.
in part because, as I was telling y'all during our meeting, I happen to have written quite a bit about this because I have a PhD in religion, and this is an area of ecological studies that I've tried to make sure I understood, because it's often been utilized, and the terms have been used as a way to not only control people, but also control the resources of the planet. And so in my book, The Spirit of Soul Food, I make the argument, building off the biblical scholars, the majority of biblical scholars who read the creation narratives as liturgical poetry, right? And so they see it as a divine prescription that encourages a healthy imagination to think and feel in ways that promote relationality and interdependence. And this is the ways in which it was written for ancient Israelite religious communities to understand how they ought to relate to the earth. And so, if you interpret it through the lens of poetry, the language of dominion and subdue, which is kind of the best way you might interpret these words, the Hebrew words that we translate that way, it connotes a view of the human vocation where human beings are assigned special status and power within a hierarchical worldview. Now, yes, the worldview is hierarchical, but this worldview doesn't necessarily lead to an oppressive dynamic between human beings and non-human nature. Instead, it is our notion of what it means to be human that is guided by a colonial worldview that elevates and has elevated white,
Mm.
heterosexual, cisgendered men as the God men who believe
Yes.
they should have the power to control the natural world that creates this oppressive dynamic. It's not in the text, it's what we add on top of the text, right?
They
It's
call
not
this
there.
eisegesis.
And not exegesis.
Reading yourself into the text.
And so the last thing I have written on there, I wrote, both the first and second creation narratives invite us to imagine a world where human nature and animals are part of our family, because we are all created from the same stuff. We're all created from dust, from the fertile soil of the earth. The family is the primary space where we can experience the responsible and loving aspects of hierarchy between grandparents, parents, and children. As such, dominion can be understood as a human position of sacred responsibility, of care designated by God, and a model for the responsible use and exercise of power. Coloniality has made this perspective of dominion difficult to imagine, particularly for many of us academics. Exactly. It is
Care,
care.
not control.
It is
Care, not
care.
control.
It
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
it's built on the logic of colonialism and whiteness. Like, it is an argument for responsible care. That's the
Yeah.
way we should best interpret what we translate to dominion. And
Mhm.
and it's so obvious when you actually read it in Hebrew. Like when you read the JPS, when you read the
Yeah.
JPS are the Jewish commentaries, basically. Like when you read what they know they wrote within their tradition, that's what they say. right? So it's right there, and yet as a form of Christian supremacy, we change it and say, "Oh no, it means this." I'm like, well,
Mhm.
they telling us what it means. How?
Well, that's right. Part of this article was like shofars all over the place, right?
Oh
The
Oh
like
God,
god.
everywhere, left and
supersessionism
right.
of like we are the chosen. So the NAR, and we're jumping around the article because we all read the article, but we have to clue you all in as listeners. So in
Yeah.
the article, it talks about how frequently at these gatherings they bring shofars and there are chuppahs and they're like integrating all of these. And we talked about last week at the Million Women's March. It didn't make it into the podcast, but in our pre-convo, we talked a lot about like supersessionism and Zionism and all these things that are also part of this conservative dominionist Christian nationalism. And what's funny about it is they're embracing those aspects of Judaism, but they're not talking to any Jews about it. Right? Because the commentary in Judaism about dominion is like very clear and quite widespread. And not to say Judaism is not monolithic. There are Judaisms just like there are Christianities, right? But there are so many Jewish scholars you could talk to about these things and it would clarify what's going on. And instead you've just like decided, and this is what supersessionism is, right? It's deciding that Christianity and one particular kind of Christianity is the successor to Judaism. And therefore you don't have to talk to Jewish people because they're not the experts. You're the experts because God chose you to carry this on. So
100%.
like so many mixed moments of like, if you just talked to other people, you wouldn't have landed here, which is why like theology has to be done in community and Christianity has to be done in community. Faith has
Mhm.
to be done in community because God never gives all the answers to one person.
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
like, even in the story of God's people, it's never just one person. It's always a community.
One thing that I was sort of, as we're talking about sort of like this adherence to, or this sort of connection with the like Jewish interpretation or Jewish sort of texts, it's wild to me that like I think the first article we read, it talked about sort of like there's an adherence to like the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures in the things that they quote and the things that they pull as like pillars for their beliefs. But in a second article that we read, titled "To Understand J.D. Vance, You Need to Meet the Theobros,"
Mm,
it talked about how these Theobros like identify with John Calvin.
yeah.
And so like, not that I think there's going to be a logical, like clear through line or some sort of consistent idea, but like, it feels like they jump around. And I'm wondering like, what is this connection to the Hebrew scriptures that seems to be so central to this movement? Like, why not, if this is a new Protestant Reformation, if it is sort of an outgrowth of John Calvin, like, why is it so Hebrew scripture centric?
I mean,
Man, the layers there.
yeah, well, I would say I think the primary reason why is John Calvin was a lawyer and he's writing from a very legally structured framework. And I think it's the legalism of Calvin that makes it appealing because Calvin tries to give, I wouldn't say simple answers to complex questions, but he definitely has a way of framing things where he's like, well, obviously the answer is this because this is how
Mm.
we understand God from a more hierarchical, structural, legal framework. And once you understand that Calvin's writing from the perspective of a lawyer, I think you can understand why someone that's this 16th century figure is writing the way they write. You know, for me, to be honest with you, I was out on Calvin when I was in undergrad, but it was because this notion of predestination. And I remember we're having
Yeah.
this conversation. So for those of you who don't know, predestination, again, is this idea that God has everything controlled, mapped out, and we already know what's going to happen, and we don't really have free will. We're kind of just going along with what God has already have planned. And I remember we having a conversation in my theology class about predestination, and it was the same day that somebody in my family had just hadn't got arrested and were in jail. And I remember thinking, I'm like, from these people's framework, my family, like the suffering that we experience in our life, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that my family member got pulled over because they were black and in a neighborhood they shouldn't have been in.
Mm-hmm.
We are suffering. We aren't experiencing the joys of being chosen, and it doesn't take into account the reality that the reason we're doing this, we experience this world, is because we're black. It has nothing to do with our salvation. It's because
Mm-hmm.
of what the structures that we have been put in. right? That has placed us in a community that doesn't look at our intentions, doesn't look at what we are doing or how we're living. It says, because you look like this, I'm going to treat you this way. And how is God blessing me or cursing me when it has nothing to do with my actual behavior and has everything to do with the system and society you have put in place that is punishing me, right? And so this for me was where I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. This notion of
Mm-hmm.
predestination has come from the framework that everybody starts out equal, and
Yep.
that's not true. That's not true. And so, yeah, I'm sure predestination, I'm sure Calvin makes sense to them if you're coming from a privileged framework. But if you're not a cisgender, white, heterosexual male who's in the middle to upper middle to high class, it's not going to work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a way of dealing with theodicy, right? This
Yes.
question of why do bad things happen? Just generally, why do bad things happen?
Yeah.
If God loves us so much, why do bad things happen? And predestination, in a lot of ways, is a way of dealing with that. To say, well, okay, well, we don't control it. God's in control of it, so it's a way to sort of dampen your yearning to see things be fixed. But then it's also a way of abdicating responsibility, right? And this is even in the article about JD Vance. Is named of like the master slave dynamic in the
Oh, I hated
Americas was
that.
actually like the healthiest Christian. I'm quoting something, my friends, don't clip this out.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But like this idea that the master slave dynamic was God ordained and it was the healthiest society because everybody lived in their place. And again, this is where caste we were talking about in our pre-conversation, the idea of caste as being God ordained, because it makes it easier for people who have power to keep their power and people who are
Mm-hmm.
impoverished to stay impoverished, and nobody has to feel bad about it if you say that it's God ordained. But that's
Well, I'm
not
sure the
Jesus. Like Jesus literally upends all of that
yeah.
and says, the last shall be first.
If slavery was God ordained, it would not have been specifically designated just for Black people.
Mm-hmm.
Period, point blank. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you know it's about racism and not about
Yep.
anything other than racism. Because if
Yep.
slavery was a good institution, white people would have been able to be enslaved by the white people, but they
Mm-hmm.
didn't. And why is that? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that ends the argument right there. If
Yeah.
they actually want to acknowledge what they're trying to say, and
Right.
so and if you want to argue for the enslavement of white folks, hey man, then let's have that argument too. You know what I'm saying? Let's have that. But they don't. They never do. And so I say this because, and I say they never do because I've had this argument with people
Mm-hmm.
before
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
about this. Because again, this actually is my area of expertise. So I want to pivot here a little bit because we are really getting into beyond the political dimensions to the religious dimensions. But before I
Mm-hmm.
leave the political, I want to say just briefly the actual impact this is having in our society today, because it
Yeah.
actually is impacting
Yeah.
our society today. And so there's
Because we're like unpacking all of the reasons that this is happening, right? We know that this is not, it's couched in religion, it's covered in religion, it's drenched in religion,
Mm-hmm.
but it is not actually about a belief in God or salvation. It is about power and control and privilege and maintaining that for the people who look a certain way. But it's
and
terrifying because of what it's
Right.
doing. So yes, please do, Dr. Carter, circle back
And
because this was terrifying to read.
and this is like I think Blair, you mentioned this last week. Lance Wallnau, he has promoted this 7 mountains mandate, and each mountain is supposed to be a sphere of society. So government, religion, media, business, education, family, and the arts and entertainment. And essentially, the idea is that the NAR leaders should dominate each. And so, what this looks like in practicality is how these leaders have tried to make sure that their teachings actually get spread into civil society. So in the article, one of the articles we read, it says in Redding, California, the 11,000 member Bethel Church now funds the local police force and trains public school teachers. In Pasadena, Korean American Apostle Shea An's Harvest Rock Church bankrolls local candidates, including one for state senate. The Remnant Alliance, an NAR affiliated group, teaches Christians across the nation to run for school boards. Mike Johnson is affiliated with people like the Speaker of the House is deeply connected to people who are practicing this kind of NAR theology. Same thing with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's happening. Like it is in like they have they have gotten their frameworks of thinking into spheres of influence, into local politics especially, but also national politics. And so I think we have to take this seriously, because I keep thinking about oh, what's that?
Oh,
Handmaid's Tale.
Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all I
Yeah,
keep thinking.
this is like they want Handmaid's Tale.
They absolutely
It's
do.
not it's not even like maybe not the colors, but like this is absolutely they want to create a theocracy in which
Yeah.
they maintain total control.
Even though they critique the theocracy of Islam and the
Right.
theocracy, they actually say, well, that's the wrong kind of theocracy. We need this kind of theocracy.
Yeah.
Wesley, go
Mhm.
ahead.
What I was going to say is to add to sort of like the insidious nature or just how like pervasive it is. Like, what is it? Harvest Rock Church. I used to live in Pasadena. I visited it.
Mm.
When I was an admissions counselor for my undergraduate, they would hold college fairs at this church. And then to cap it all off, Bethel Church, like we used to use Bethel Church music in the loft. And I
Mhm.
visited many, welcoming churches across Los Angeles that use Bethel music in their worship. So like, even if we're sort of like wanting to feel like it's not really here or it's not really with us, like this is already in churches, like the money is being funneled up to provide for these things. So it's like, it's absolutely wild.
And the NAR, pardon me, is like a branch of this, but it's the concept of Christian nationalism is so widespread and so insidious. And things like I grew up listening to Focus on the Family
Mm.
audio tapes as I fell asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they were, Bible stories, but like Focus on the Family is deeply like you run back the money, and it's these same groups of like hyper conservative Christian nationalists who want to like control every aspect of society because they genuinely believe that's the only way to defeat the demonic forces. And that was I like Progressive United Methodist, where my like choir director was a lesbian, and I'm still getting Focus on the Family in my daily life. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it is terrifying how pervasive it is.
And I think this is the thing when we talk about how information and truth begins to spread. Like it is so it's the tentacles begin to stretch everywhere, in as much as you pick up these practices and ideas and habits and you're not quite sure where they came from, right? And I
Mhm.
think that's a big part of it. You're like, oh, this it's something that we do, but I don't know exactly where this came
Yep.
from. I was listening to a song that I know we've sang in the loft a couple of times, and for some reason I don't know what happened. Like I heard it differently, and the song ultimately is actually talking about. It says there's a line in the song that says, "Make our nation turn back to you." And I was like listening to it and I was like, whoop. I was like, oh, can't sing this song. Like, like it's things like that
Mm.
where you have to like catch it. You're like,
It's
what?
everywhere.
And it's just these little bits. But like if you're not paying attention, you can internalize some of these lies, because they are being extremely strategic about the work that they're doing. Right. I think one of the things, as we transition to talking about the religion, and I'm curious, Blair and Wesley, if you have any thoughts or reflections on this. One of the things that they're doing essentially is, broadly speaking, encouraging pastors to de-link themselves from broader denominations, right? So
Mhm.
that they actually can have power, and really the pastor has the ultimate authority. And I kept thinking about, for those of you who don't know, Blair and I are United Methodist clergy, and our denomination is in the middle of or going through a split along the lines of issues of, broadly speaking, because of issues of gender and sexuality, and including all of God's children as saying they can be ordained. I wonder how many of our churches, we were told they were splitting over this issue of gender sexuality, but is it really about power? Or how much of
Oh,
it is
it's
it about
absolutely about
power?
power.
How much of it is it about like literally being like, I don't want to have to answer to anyone, even if I
Yeah.
kind of don't even really care. But anyway, it just really spoke to me. I
They're
was like, oh my
like
gosh.
the group that splintered off is even at risk of like eliminating the episcopacy, like not having
Mm,
bishops anymore.
Whoa.
And they don't require you to go to seminary. Like, so I will say the United Methodist Church is an incredibly arduous ordination process, right? It took me 9 years from beginning to end to get through. It was like, in some ways, I think harder than tenure. Like, although I don't have tenure yet, so I don't know. But like, it's a similar process, and just the number of people who have to say yes, you are allowed to carry the title pastor is so intense, and it beats people down. But at the same time, generally, it means people who shouldn't be in power won't be. Like, there, unfortunately, famously, several former Methodist pastors who couldn't get ordained, and so they started cults. Jim Jones, being one of them, was a pastor, a Methodist pastor, and
Wow.
then couldn't get through the ordination process, so he started a cult instead. So,
This is
like,
crazy.
You didn't know that,
those,
Wesley?
No.
yeah, like those
Uh,
processes exist to keep people who can't understand how not to abuse power out of control, or at least they're supposed to. And so, yeah, when you're encouraged to break away from systems of accountability, then that it's just creating an environment where abuse is going to run rampant. And then it's not just spiritual abuse, it becomes sexual abuse, it becomes molestation, it becomes total control over women, it becomes all of these things, because failing to hold one another accountable in love becomes a slippery slope. And they
yeah.
argue, right? They would argue the opposite, right? Of like,
Mm-hmm.
they use that same argument against us. So I know, like, those words are coming out of my mouth, but like, oh, well, letting queer people becomes, all these other terrible things that like have nothing to do with who you love and being fully human. So you can throw the insults both directions, but I think that ultimately the goal again comes back to how are we living in community together in ways that are doing the least amount of harm possible and the most amount of good.
Yeah.
So, Wesley, I'm curious. Now I know none of us grew up explicitly in like NAR aligned religious spaces, but I'm curious about, as you were reading these articles, to what extent did you see some of the teachings that you encountered resonate with or were similar to maybe some of the teachings that you had encountered growing up? Right? Because I know for me, I was definitely like, I kind of did learn something that was similar to this, right?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of like, so I grew up in the Church of Christ, fundamentalist tradition. For those who don't know, like we didn't have instruments in worship. It was all a cappella.
Mm-hmm.
Women couldn't be in leadership. They couldn't teach. The few moments that they were relegated to the opportunity to teaching, it was just to women or just to children. They couldn't serve in any committee. Like, the treasurer always had to be a man. Like that was the structure. Like I don't know that I got a lot of like dominion over the earth conversations growing up. I think I benefited from the fact that it was a Spanish speaking congregation, and so like it didn't have the same flavor of supremacy in the same way. It had patriarchy for sure, but not supremacy. And so it's consistent. And it's just like, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine because I grew up, closeted in this tradition. So like, what it is to like know that your ability to participate in this tradition in this community is going to be limited forever. And so, yeah, I mean, it's consistent. I just don't think it was as radical, and I think part of that
Mm.
had to do with it was an immigrant community, a Spanish speaking community who weren't like in power in society writ large. So like it just had to take on a different flavor, but it still had those aspects of patriarchy.
And I think this is where it's helpful to actually tease that out a little bit in terms of pointing out how an immigrant community is, by its very nature, especially a Latinx immigrant community, is probably not going to have the supremacist framework and strand because of the way in which we've structured power in this country, right? Whereas if they were coming from a background with the caste system,
Mm,
then one might be able to
yeah.
actually absorb that and think, okay, then I can actually fall in line with this as well. Um,
This is raising for me that we had mentioned we might talk about, and we can come back to the NAR, but talking about the Trump rally in which everyone was insulted horrendously, basically. But particularly the comedian who, right, made what he thought was a joke, but was a dehumanizing statement about Puerto Ricans. And I saw someone on Twitter ask, like, why all of a sudden are the Puerto Ricans actually up in arms? Like, why is it that? Like, why all the things he said, all the racist things that have swirled around Trump, why is it that the Puerto Ricans being insulted is responding to everyone? And a Puerto Rican person on Twitter said, because a lot of Puerto Ricans consider themselves to be white.
Mm,
And
hmm.
and so to suddenly hear that the dehumanizing and racist things were actually like being said about them too, a lot of them hadn't realized. And when you think about caste, right? Like even within communities of color, there are these fine for me, but not for thee kind of
Yeah.
moments.
I mean, I'll
yeah.
add also that, like, when you think about sort of like a common sort of immigrant experience or Latinx experience is immigration. Like, there
Mhm.
is that sort of barrier that both like Puerto Ricans and Cubans don't have to deal with
Yeah.
by nature of being Puerto Ricans Americans and Cubans having an agreement that when they step onto the soil, they get the citizenship. Like, they don't have that same struggle that like Mexicans or Salvadorans or Guatemalans like have. It is going to make them feel like that's them. They're another. We're a different group of people. They can't be talking about us. They're talking about immigration, mass deportation. That doesn't
Mhm.
affect us. We're not aligned in the same way. But they're not going to see that. Like, these conservative Republicans are not going to see you differently just because you're Puerto Rican. They're going to see you as brown, and they're going to want to get rid of you.
Yeah.
We've already had mass deportations in this country historically, and I think we would do well to actually learn our history and there were many when we did
How
have the
much
last
damage
one
it
in the
caused. Yeah.
not how much damage it caused, how much money it cost, and how many people we deported back to Mexico who were American citizens.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this yeah, so this has happened in the past, but and it leaves so much trauma in the wake of what happened. Go ahead, Blair.
And the JD Vance article about the Theobros talks about how they're really committed, and this is like a branch of this similar Christian nationalism, different from the NAR, but more reformed Calvinist groups and they are really focused on this idea of like American as a nationality and like yeah, so that there's like a certain way to be American, but for them that's whiteness. Like whiteness is what's appropriate, and it's fine if we have immigrants as long as they like assimilate to what the standards and expectations of whiteness are. And all throughout this, as I was reading this article, I just kept thinking about the theological arguments about blood and soil that were pushed by German Nazi theologians. So I think I said this last week or 2 weeks ago. Like, this is Nazi theology. It is exactly what was pushed in the churches in the national church of Germany, right? So in the United States context, we don't have a national church. That's what our separation of church and state means. It means the state can't determine what people's religions are, which is why this whole Christian nationalism thing is stupid because it's deeply unconstitutional. But also that the church can't determine what the government does. Now, in Germany, church and state were tied up to each other. There was a national church, and right, and in a lot of countries around the world, this is the case. But basically, the German theological position was that and this was even in their missionary literature, that like blood and soil is the deepest bond between humans, and therefore, if you want people to become Christians, you can only like you need to limit them to their ethnic identity because that is the only way they can convert, because they have to belong to community that is community of blood and soil, that is stronger than anything else. So by that meaning like literal family or national identity. And so they are literally calling for us to go back to this Nazi theology of blood and soil above all other things. And we all know how that story went, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
and it was being preached in churches and nobody said anything about it. And it just became like, and that's what's so concerning to me about like these NAR groups is like they just slowly seep into everything, and the school boards, and like they're influencing public education and the kind of curriculum, and they're doing Bible studies in the classroom. And like that's how we ask, like, how did the Germans become Nazis? How did like normal German people become Nazis? That way.
Yeah.
By having Nazis on the local school board and having nobody get up in arms about it. And so the extent to which this dominionist Christian nationalist theology is already a part of our everyday life is what is so terrifying to me, because we have seen this story play out before and everybody lost. Everybody lost.
Yeah.
No, and I think even within that example you used, I mean, you have like people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer or like small minorities of German Christians who resisted, many of
Right.
whom were also put in concentration camps
And murdered.
murdered because of their work, including Bonhoeffer. And so, yeah, we often like to think that we will be able to stand against the crowd, but that is not easy. And actually, Wesley, I know we were talking about Isabel Wilkerson earlier in her book Cast. That's the first chapter in her book is called The Man in the Crowd. And she's talking about the man at Nuremberg, I think is where it was, where everybody else is given the Sig Heil and he isn't. And how he was ostracized for not committing to Nazism, but for him, it was because he was in love with a Jewish woman. He just knew, like he in his bones, he was like, well, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why this work or that kind of rhetoric is so popular, and we've touched on this the last couple of sessions, but we don't want to drill on it today. So I know next week when we have our conversation, maybe we can talk a little bit less about this and talk about some other topics around how is Christian nationalism playing out in the political sphere, especially because it's going to be the election next week.
Yeah, you're hopeful about what we're going to talk about next week.
I know. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. We may just be having a podcast from, I don't even know, man. Like we might be all moving to Mexico. Yeah, exactly.
Lamenting.
It's this notion of spiritual warfare. And I think for me, this is where, now that I have learned a little bit about TikTok, I learned a little bit about posting some things that are doing well to be like, oh, I see what I didn't tell y'all. And I was waiting to shave on this podcast is, so for those of you, we talk at the end of each of these episodes about following our socials. I made a post about
a little viral moment.
I had a little viral moment at a post on pastor in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Donnie Swaggart, about this thing about how somebody needs to speak to the black church, and it's this white Southern man. And I was like, well, this is ridiculous. And I went through and I articulated why what he was saying was ignorant. Luckily, the algorithm turned on anti-bullying protections, because what happened was there's a button you can click so I can actually see the comments that people are making. And I was like, oh, this is wild, man. I have to leave this off, because I would get so angry. I wouldn't post anything because it was super racist, like super duper racist. And the ways in which people were calling me out of my name or calling me possessed by the demons and demonic and stuff like that. And all it did was help me understand more concretely how people have bought into the language of spiritual warfare. Like they justify dehumanizing language and rhetoric by saying they're at war and I am the enemy. And you hear political leaders use this language. You hear Trump use it. You hear Mike Johnson use it. You hear all these conservatives use this language of enemy, and it is borrowed from Christian nationalism. And so one of the articles we read, they wrote, demons and demonic influence as well as spiritual warfare are central to NAR belief and practice, and those who do not prescribe to their views are seen as possessed or under demonic influence. There are claims that whole neighborhoods, cities, even nations are under the sway of the demonic. Other religions, such as Islam, are also said to be demonically influenced. One cannot compromise with evil. And so if Democrats, liberals, queer people, and others are seen as demonic, political compromise, the heart of democratic life becomes difficult, if not impossible. And this is where we get to the point where we have a legislature, a Congress that has done nothing for 2 years. Just the most ineffective Congress we've had forever is when we have the people in there right now, because they're in their brain, like the heart of democracy is compromise. Like that is how it works. Like it can, and they're not willing to compromise because they believe theologically they shouldn't have to, and that it's not right. And so we end up in a space where, in order for them to get things done, they say, well, if you want to, everybody has to be just like us. Otherwise we can't get anything done. And that leads us to a very dangerous place.
Which is also like, it's not the gospel. This is where I like, so it's so weird because I'm definitely evangelical. Like I am evangelical in my bones, but I grew up in a progressive church, right? And I am evangelical from the perspective of love and liberation. So I do believe in spiritual warfare. And what I believe spiritual warfare is about is how are we fighting for the most loving, least harmful thing for the most people?
Yeah.
Because I think demonic possession is greed and capitalism. That's of the devil. That's of the devil. And actually the Bible backs me up on that, right? And and we talked last week about the fruits of the Spirit. If you're seeing the fruits of the Spirit, that means the Spirit is winning. And so it just like, I don't use that language very often because it's so triggering for people, because it's been used to harm people so much. But like, I genuinely do believe we are in a battle for liberation and for love. And this is where I get frustrated with my kinfolk and skinfolk of the progressive areas, is like, instead of pushing back and proclaiming what the gospel is, that love is the story of Christ, that liberation is the story of Christ, that resurrection is the story of Christ, that inclusion is the story of Christ. Instead of getting out there and saying that, we just went into our little churches to pat ourselves on the back about how good we are for helping homeless people. Right. And
Yep.
so that's why I study evangelism, right? It's because I'm like, the loudest voice is going to be what people think this is. And we have been far too quiet for far too long. And it has let so many people be hurt because they're not hearing any other version of what the Spirit is and who God is. So there's my little preaching moment for the day. I'm sorry, y'all.
Well, I think as a way to kind of wrap our conversation up, one of the things that I noticed in the very beginning of the article was how one of these churches were open basically 24 hours a day, how they have like an indoor playground. They have all this stuff to make it easy for you to Wesley, to use your language, to fold into the community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, Wesley and I have these conversations around, okay, how can we get more people involved and integrated? What does it mean to do? And so, Wesley, I'm actually kind of curious on your thoughts on this. Like, you see how seriously they take making it as easy as possible for people to get involved because they want you to join. And they're like, we have to do. And if you feel like the stakes are life and death, then the motivation for you is to participate in your church community to do it. Whereas I'm not preaching the stakes. I'm not
Right.
preaching like that, right? And so that motivation to inspire people to do stuff and to manipulate people, I would argue, isn't there. It's about persuasion. And so, yeah, I just saw that, Wesley, and I was just like, oh my gosh, they are trying to make it as easy as possible so that they can invite people in to ultimately indoctrinate them into this way that's evil.
Yeah. And I think when I was like, so many of these churches are independent churches and they're largely white churches. And so it's like this sort of stacking on of realities of like, of course, these campuses are massive and have all the amenities. They're pulling money from the group of people who have the most money. So, of course, they're able to offer like whatever they can to keep people there. I think the article said that there's a barn that people are like volunteer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week so that it's always open. I'm like, that is a commitment that I can't imagine our community replicating. But the other side of it is fear and the quest for power are much stronger motivators than like what you would think that wanting people to have love and community and connection would have the same amount of like power. But for whatever reason, the search for power and fear of whatever is so much easier to get people to rally behind. And I'm like, okay, so how do we create a parallel that says love and connection and community and human flourishing is just as enthralling as the desire for power? And I don't know how to do that or how we get there, but like there has to be some way to get people to see that, yeah, the importance of these things that aren't motivated by power and by fear. But yeah, it's I mean, I don't know how long I was scared of going to hell growing up, of that being the motivating factor of like going to church and like getting baptized. Like so many people talk about being scared of hell, and it's like, yeah, that'll keep you in the church for a long time.
Yeah.
And the like study of church growth, especially in the like second half of the 20th century in America, there was this claim that like, well, conservative churches grow faster, so that their theology must be right. And to me, it just means their theology is more effective at getting people to show up. It doesn't mean it's right, because you look inside the doors and do you find the fruits of the Spirit?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes.
Mm.
In micro ways, right? Like, it's not to say all conservative communities are just absolute terror or abuse all the time. But yeah, to me, again, the question comes back to, it's not about how many people are showing up, it's the quality of the community that you find. So yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I was thinking, if people need a glimmer of hope in the midst of this conversation and leading into the election next week, his book, The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together, are some of the most profound writings, because he literally wrote them while in hiding from the Nazis and trying to create an underground seminary so that they could continue to train people in theology that wasn't steeped in Nazism. And he really dives into like, what does it look like to build that kind of community that is focused on the loving story of Christ's coming into humanity and loving us. So that's like a really easy one to pick up this week to try to give yourself a little glimmer of hope, a little question of like, what could this look like if we did push back?
Yeah, and to be clear for y'all, like Bonhoeffer's a blonde hair, blue-eyed white dude, but also he got radicalized when he came to Union, and he was living in Harlem and going to black churches. Like that is what radicalized him, or helped him. He would say in his writing, articulate what he knew to be true. He needed people to help him articulate what he knew to be true, and he made the choice to go back to Germany, even though he didn't have to help serve and save his community. It's a very powerful story. I think hopefully in the next few episodes we can also begin. We need to unpack this next week. Lord knows what we're going to be talking about. We're going to have to be praying. I'm being my prayer closet with my with my oils and all this stuff that I saw my grandma doing. That's what I'm be doing.
24 hours of prayer around election day, maybe.
Man, everything that I saw her doing, I'm like, no, I got to do that. I got to just do all that stuff to the hope and trying to have some optimism that things can potentially not turn out terrible for not just us, but for the global impact of what would happen is amazing in all the negative ways. But we are going to be talking about not just what is, we wanted to have this episode to talk about what Christian nationalism is, what NAR is, and then in future episodes talk about how might we articulate a theology that critiques and push back against these beliefs. Although it's kind of interspersed in what we're talking about today, we want to also equip and teach and say, hey, if you have people in your family who follow this is what you can say to them to really push them to think critically, not to argue, but to help them grow, is what I would say. So thank you, Wesley. Thank you, Blair, for joining me today. I want to thank you all for joining us for the Progressive Christian Podcast. If you would like to connect with us and be a part of the conversation, you can find us on Instagram at The Progressive Christians and on TikTok at The Progressive Christians. If you like the show, we want to invite you to rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using. Thanks for listening, and we will see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.